Morning, and thank you for joining the call related to the September 2021 Summer Market Performance Report. My name is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the meeting. The report is available on the Reports and Bulletin page under the Market and Operations tab on ISO's website and also on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings page, along with this presentation. Guillermo Batista Alderete, who is the Director of Market Analysis and Forecasting, will provide an overview of the report. And then we also from Guillermo's team, we have Abhishek Hundawali, Amber Motley, Rahul Kalaskar, and Zhu Lang. We are recording the call, and we will post the video file on the Miscellaneous Stakeholder Meetings webpage for a limited time. Please request permissions from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. We are going to pause for questions throughout the call, and I will provide instructions for how to raise your hand at that time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Guillermo.
Thank you, Christina, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for participating in this call. As we have done for the last few months of the summer of 2021, we have been gathering information about the summer performance along the different areas of interest given the conditions that we experienced in the summer of 2020. We committed to have a more focused effort on assessing the performance of the markets for the summer months, going from June through September. And with the posting and discussion of the September performance, I think we have completed the cycle of that focus analysis. We are not going to continue doing this analysis for the subsequent months, given the conditions naturally arise during the summer months. That is the critical periods when we deal with tight supply conditions and all the factors that we have elaborated in the recent months. This is the last set of information that we are putting for the summer. And as usual, as we have done for the previous months, I would like to take a few minutes to go over a summary of the main items that we identify for the September month. And you're going to see that they are quite similar to what we have discussed in the last previous reports. We can go for the next slide, please. By early August, we have implemented all the enhancements that we projected to have for the summer 2021, and therefore there hasn't been any change between the August and September timeframes. We can have here summarized the different enhancements that we have implemented so far through the summer. And as you may see, some of them didn't trigger at all in the September timeframe. And this is a reflection of the conditions that materialized for the month of September. In particular, I think the last item that we have focused our attention is regarding the load, export, and wheeling priorities, and we will elaborate on that through the presentation. Next slide, please. I think we are past the summer, obviously, and we are sure that we have reached our peak for the year. That peak indeed happened in the month of September. That was on September 8th, and we were shy of the 44,000 megawatts. When we compare the load peak against the monthly CEC forecast or the array capacity, we can see that we were under those reference levels. The peak load was below the CEC forecast. We have sufficient array capacity to be able to meet the load obligation. That includes the load forecast quantities plus the operating reserves. And you can see that the trend shows a downward direction now that we start going into the cooler weather. Next slide, please. In general, September was quieter than previous months. I think the most challenging time was in the month of July. Since then, conditions have been milder. There was a period of in the month of September, it was somewhere between September 4th through the 9th, when we have some high loads and we have warmer weather, and that is the reason we hit the peak load in the September 8 time frame. Even though these were kind of warmer conditions, tighter supply conditions, we didn't reach the level that we experienced in previous months, such as those of July. In particular, we didn't have any energy warnings or emergencies. We didn't have to trigger any scarcity pricing. That is one of the summer enhancements that we implemented. We didn't have any infestabilities of supply projected in the day-ahead market that could have triggered this new logic that we have to enforce the minimum state of charge for storage resources. And because we didn't have any warning or energy emergencies, we didn't require to activate the reliability demand response. These are very specific items that typically are going to be triggered based on a very tight supply condition, and that didn't happen overall in the month of September. Next slide, please. However, around the period of September 8 and 9, when we have the highest loads of the month and of the year, we did issue flex alerts for 2 days. That was for September 8th and September 9th. And similar to what we have assessed in the previous months, we got some estimates of what the energy conservation was related to the flex alert calls. And depending on the hour and depending on the day, you can see that the energy conservation ranged anywhere between 0 megawatts up to 650 megawatts. That is by hour. It's not the uncertainty of the estimates. It's just different values per hour. So the maximum conservation was 650 megawatts, and that was achieved in the peak time of September 9th. And that's a good and meaningful amount of capacity that can be absorbed through energy conservation, and obviously it's a help to meet supply and demand conditions for these tight days. Next slide, please. When comparing the load needs, that includes the operating reserves, against the supply that is readily available in the market, and we move into the day-ahead time frame, we have shown this comparison. And the shaded areas represent the capacity, the supply that is readily available in the market once we account for any outages of the rates. And you can see in comparison to the purple and dotted lines of the load, where we stand in terms of the supply. And as you can see, even for the critical days of September 8 and 9, there was sufficient array capacity to be able to meet the load obligation, including the operating reserves. As we progress through the month, things start to cool down. We did have some days in the range of September 18, 19, where the load was significantly lower, and it trended up again in the middle of the second half of the month. But overall, you can see that September was relatively quiet and with load levels, in some cases, lower than 30,000 megawatts. Next slide, please. Let me pause and see if we have any questions so far before we change topics.
Excuse me. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand by using the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed in, you're going to want to press #2. Or you can also send your question in the chat to all panelists. We'll just give it a couple of seconds. Okay, I don't see any questions, Guillermo.
Okay. Another area that we have analyzed quite closely is the performance of the intertie schedules. This is one of the trends that we show through the report, in which we compare the trends of the supply, defined as the dynamic resources plus the static imports, and the exports, in this case, in the opposite direction because they act like demand. And we also break down the amount of the wheels that are those explicitly wheeling through the system. As you can see, the trend is quite nice to see how it evolves through the month. Naturally, we were coming from these warmer conditions, tighter supply conditions, higher demand for exports through the month of August. And when we have these warmer days in early September, naturally the condition is going to be reflected in the volume of exports that we have. And you can see that the exports increase in the same period, and where we have tighter supply conditions around September 5th through the 9th. And after that, the export you can see reduced dramatically is based on system conditions, not just in the CAISO, but across the West. And this also means that overall our net schedule interchange improved or increased through the month of September. As a reference, we indicate that for the peak hours out ending 17 through 21, on average, the net interchange that we had in August was about 6,000 megawatts. Once we move into the time frame of September, that increased up to 7,500 megawatts. It's a natural increase of the supply coming from the net interchange in two fashions. One, because we have higher imports, but also because we have lower amounts of exports. I think we have a question, Christina.
Let's see. Is it? Oh, there we go. Yep. Okay. From Arturo Avalos, were there any exports cuts on the 8th or 9th?
Yes, there were, and I think we covered those in a couple of slides down the presentation. So I can hold a little bit on the answer.
Okay, great, thanks. And then it looks like we're on the phone. So Kira, go ahead.
Holly, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Michelle Quito from the CPUC. Looking at the wheels and looking at the data that CAISO posted on their website, it looks like folks signed up for 600 megawatts of the wheels that were supposed to be given priority to load. But I believe the report says that only maybe 97, I'm not sure what my numbers are, maybe you guys discuss it later, only 97 ever scheduled wheels in September. And I'm just wondering, I was under the impression that they had to have firm transmission and a firm contract for the hours, I guess, 5 or 6 days a week, 17 hours. What does it tell you that no one scheduled the wheels that were giving priority to similar to load?
Yeah, and I have a specific section down the deck, Michelle. If you don't mind, we can just wait a little bit until I cover that section, and I will address your question in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Okay. Kira, any in the queue?
There are no further questions at this time.
I don't see any chat questions either. So, okay, go ahead, Guillermo.
Okay, and this is a final view of the composition of the exports, given the different priorities and the scheduling types that we have in the market. And this follows the same structure that we have presented in the past. We have exports associated with transmission ownership rights, and we have different priorities, whether they are coming from the day ahead directly or straightforward into the real time, whether they are high priority or low priority, and including the economic bids for exports. The overall volume is the same as is shown in the previous slide. It's just how we show the composition of the overall volume. And you can see, in general, the main contributors to the exports is associated with TORs and these existing transmission rights. There are some spikes in the period of September 8 and 9, and that is composed by the different type of priorities. And there is a small portion of economic exports that may have cleared through the market. But overall, you can see the volume significantly reduced in comparison to previous months, as early as the trend that is shown in early August. Next slide, please. Going back to the first question that we got from one participant, overall for the month of September, we didn't have any day-ahead supply infestabilities, and that is shown in the lower left plot. And under supply infestability, which show with positive values, we do have infestabilities in the downward direction, meaning we have conditions of oversupply. there were days in which we have just too much generation in comparison to the amount of demand that we have to meet in the ROC process. And that's the reason that the market may rely on this relaxation of the power balance in the oversupply condition. But we didn't have any undersupply where we are short or limited of supply. The upper plot shows a trend, and it's kind of difficult to identify the different colors, but this just highlights that there were indeed projected reductions of exports in the day-ahead process, in the ROC process, and they were for both September 8 and September 9 for a few hours, typically in the evening hours. And the composition is mainly for economic and low priority exports, even though for September 8 there were some exports of high priority that were projected to be reduced. When that happens, those resources may still have the opportunity to come directly into the real time and see if the conditions exist for them to be able to clear. In the report, we also have some more details of how these exports realized in the real time. And there were some exports that actually were cut in the hash process in the real time market. They don't perfectly align with the same exports that were reduced in the day-ahead market, but there was some volume of exports curtailed in the real time. Next slide, please. This is the information regarding wheels, and we have been providing this information in the same fashion for the last 3 months. And as you may recall, when we implemented the load, export, and priority scheduling penalty prices as early as August 4th, we introduced this new concept of wheel transactions can be registered 45 days in advance, and if so, then they can get this high priority in the market. If they are not registered, they can still self-schedule as a standard self-schedule, and that would assign low priority.
Slide?
Sorry, yeah. What we have here is just the 2 groups of the wheels that we have, and the portion in purple effectively shows that all the wheels that we have for September were treated in the market as low priority wheels, meaning they didn't have this register-based high priority treatment in the market. Now, I want to highlight, similar to what I did in the August report, this is effectively what the market utilized in clearing the schedules. And there is a subtle catch here, because one is what the market considered and utilized versus the other portion that is what the market participants intended to use, and because of a couple of issues, these transactions couldn't come properly into our systems. That would just change the categorization of between the blue and the purple. It wouldn't change the volume at all. So for the month of September, as Michelle was already signaling, there was very little use of wheel transactions, even for those that were registered 45 days in advance with the high priority treatment. For the period of September 5th through the 9th, the wheels that were utilized with this high priority were 96 megawatts, and that was all what was utilized in September. Let me go one more slide, and then I will come back to Michelle's question, please. And this compares the utilization of the high priority wheels in the day-ahead market, or that were intended to be used in the market, versus the total volume and wheels transactions that were registered to be assigned high priority treatment. Through the registration process, we had up to 687 megawatts of registered wheels that were assigned the high priority treatment. When it comes into what was actually utilized in the market, is this 96 megawatts for 5 days in early September. Coming back to Michelle's questions, this is what we see. Obviously, we went through the registration process and we check every single of the requests, and that is the volume that we got of 687. What eventually was bidding in the market is 96 megawatts. What can we make out of this? I think I would leave it open. I can express what we see, and it's effectively what was utilized only these 5 days. I think one factor to consider is that the conditions of the load naturally evolved quite dramatically in the downward direction from September. Load levels were low in comparison to previous months. In some cases, we ran into overgeneration conditions in the period of September 16, 17, 19. And there were some wheel transactions utilized in September, and they happened to be in the warmest period of September. That was anywhere between September 4th and the 9th. So it makes sense that the wheels will show up to some extent on those days. The rest of the month is relatively mild in terms of high loads and limited supply. I could see some logical thinking why the wheels wouldn't be coming in, because there are no such conditions so stressed to the point that additional supply is needed. And that is as much as I could elaborate. That is what we see. We don't see anything beyond that. Obviously, it's more up to the participants how they utilize their resources that they have available to meet their system needs. The factor I'm just highlighting is that loads in general and supply conditions in September were much milder than the previous months of the summer. Michelle, I don't know if you have any follow-up on this.
Michelle, I'm not sure if you're on audio, but you can go ahead and press pound 2, or if you're in the WebEx, you can select the raise hand icon. Or if anybody else has a question, I know that Dan Williams submitted a chat question.
Do you have a question on the line?
Okay, go ahead.
Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Guillermo, this is Michelle. I just have a couple of comments. One of which is, given that pattern, it suggests that those wheels are more economic wheels, not necessarily firm transactions. That's just one comment. And then I'd also note, on the next slide, you're going to show that the CPUC RA firm transaction actions mostly delivered. And so I note here that for the transactions that were requiring firm transmission, and those would be the wheels, those didn't deliver. And then I would note that the CPUC imports that don't necessarily have firm transmission primarily delivered. So I would just note that there's that, that sort of, it's sort of the opposite of what, CAISO is looking for in the RA enhancements initiative, where they want firm transmission. And I would say here the evidence is that firm transmission doesn't really guarantee that the specific resource shows up. So I'd note that. And then I just have one question for you. In July, we talked about this issue of the penalty parameters on the transmission constraints not being correct, and that being a potential reliability issue. And I haven't really heard anything about that. Like it seems like a really big deal, and it seems like something that CAISO would want to address. And I'm just wondering what the time frame is on that, because it's my understanding that the tariff needs to be changed, and it probably needs to be in place for next summer. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any color on that. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I can elaborate on that. You're right. In July, we had this condition that we elaborated about overscheduling on interties when we have this heavy rates on Malin and NOP. And you're right. In order for us to effectuate any change, it has to go through a tariff process. And because it's a tariff process, what we are doing is effectively treating this item as a more formal stakeholder engagement. So right now we're in the last round of completing the draft and the proposal that we want to put forward. So I would say between this week and next week, the first paper, the issues paper and the straw proposal is going to be out. And then you will see that we have a whole set of dates to be able to go through the entire process. The expectation is that we will have this before next summer because of this are concerned mainly when we have these very tight conditions. So we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to effectuate the changes prior to the summer. So in short, by next week, you should be able to see the paper posted externally.
Great. Thanks for the update.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Any other questions in the queue? If not, I can go to the chat question.
And there are no further questions.
Okay. So Dan Williams from CES has a few questions. So he has questions on slide 9. Let me go ahead and go back to that slide. So he asked, is the RUC oversupply infeasibility driven by PMIN levels on RUC commitments for later in the day, or is it primarily renewables-based oversupply? So that's his first question.
Yeah. I think oversupply is a combination of factors. It's not just one side driver. And naturally, we have, and the timing is important, and you can see when that happened. It happens, relatively speaking, in terms of a combination of low load levels, and then you may have extra supply that may happen typically in the middle of the day. That is the penetration of solar resources. And that is typically the time frame when we observe oversupply. Now, how much we can effectuate or minimize the imbalance in the RUC process. We can reduce schedules that were previously scheduled in the IFM. When it comes to the PMIN, that is part of the question, we cannot really shut down resources in the RUC process. If they were committed and started up in the IFM process, the limitation is that we cannot decommit or shut down these resources. And in some cases, once you exhaust all the decremental capability that we have to still try to balance the supply and demand. And if there is no more resources to decrementally dispatch, and we cannot longer decommit resources, the condition is going to be that we are going to have an oversupply condition. That means we have more generation than the demand forecast.
Well, and then his second question, is the ability for storage to help with oversupply taken into account in RUC when assessing the infeasibility?
Yes, all resources are assessed, whether they can move decrementally. In this case, if the storage resources can absorb more demand, is going to be also considered. But again, I want to emphasize that oversupply is a condition of resulting from a combination of factors. It's not just one single driver, and all of them play in different ways. The storage resources can help us to reduce that oversupply.
Thanks, Guillermo. And then his final question, is there any price impact from the oversupply in infeasibility?
Generally speaking, it will not, because that is going to be realized in the RUC process, and the only capacity that is impacted potentially by prices in the RUC is for any RUC award. And when you have oversupply conditions, typically you will not have a RUC award. There may be congestion driven that may require some resources at the same time to ink, and therefore there may be some RUC awards, but otherwise in general there will be no price impact, just because they are not in general utilized for the settlements, only those that get a RUC award.
Thank you. So let me know if you have additional questions, Dan. And I don't see any other chat questions. Anybody in the queue, Kira?
Questions in the queue?
Okay. Doesn't look like Dan has any other.
Okay. The next slide is about the trend that we have been tracking regarding the CPUC jurisdictional array imports. And effectively, we track the volume of these array imports that are being at or below the 0 megawatts. In some cases, it's not just an economic bid, but it could be a self-schedule. And the trend is quite similar to previous months, and we are seeing that the majority of all the array imports, a large portion, basically 99% of the time, and the volume they are really bidding at or below the $0 per megawatt, the $0 per megawatt hour, and that is the expected outcome. The volumes naturally are going to change from month to month. In some cases, like we explained in July, and there were factors that reduce the capability of certain interties, and that naturally is going to be reflected in the trends. So that is something that we have really elaborated for the month of July and some extent for the month of August. Next slide, please. In batteries were impacted in the month of September mainly because there were some outages, and that reduced effectively the capacity available for dispatch and for storage availability. And you can see just the comparison between August and September. Naturally, the overall and the average trend of the dispatches and the state of charge was lower in September than in August, just because we have reduced capability on the storage resources. That said, the trend, sorry, can we go back? The trend continues to hold, and that effectively reflects the nice interplay where batteries are being charged in the middle of the day, and they are discharged in the evening, night peak hours, and that is an ideal condition to see how that is coming out of the market. Next slide, please. The other area that we have been tracking closely with the summer enhancements is related to the resource sufficiency evaluation, specifically the outcome of the capacity test, because as you may recall, one of the enhancements that we implemented back in, I believe it was June 15, related to the treatment of the uncertainty in the capacity test. Prior to this change, the capacity test only accounted for the demand and requirements. And also, with the implementation of this enhancement, we added the uncertainty requirement that is utilized in the flexible ramping test also to the capacity test. Effectively, the requirement for the capacity test increased effectively just because we have this additional capacity of the uncertainty. The natural consequence is that as you have higher requirements, there may be more conditions for that test to fail. And since we have reported this starting on June 16, we have seen a significant increase in the frequency of the capacity test failures across the EIM footprint, not just for the CAISO, but also for effectively all the EIM entities. And for the month of September, it was more than 100% increase. If we wouldn't have the uncertainty requirement in the capacity test, we would have observed about 71 total intervals of failures for the capacity test across all EIM entities. With the addition of the uncertainty requirement to the capacity test, that has increased to 193 intervals of failures across all EIM entities. That is more than double the number of failures with the inclusion of the uncertainty requirement. This is, in general, the main items we wanted to discuss for the month of September. It helps that September was a milder month in comparison to other summer months. The last slide, can we go there, please? Just summarizes the issues that we encountered through the month of September. And the first one is not a new issue. We introduced that. The second item is not a new issue. We introduced that in the discussion of August, and that has to do with the proper labeling and treatment of the registered wheels in the market system. In order for those resources to make it into the market, they have to go through the bidding system. And it is here where the assignment of the scheduling priority is given to these wheel transactions. We have a software issue that is impacting the mapping of those wheel transactions. So even though they were being utilized for those that were registered properly in advance, when it came into the market, they still came as low priority. Given the conditions that we have, that had not impact because they still were fully clear in the market. The first issue is a new issue that has not been discussed before, that impacted only one single transaction in the month of September, in which a wheel transaction that came in, we didn't have the two components of the wheel. Only the import was coming into the system, the export was not recognized, and we were going to deal with that specific issue, specific to that resource. We have that issue fixed on September 23. And with that, I think that's all what we have for discussing today. I would like to open up for any questions at this point before we conclude the call.
Sure. So again, you can press the raise hand icon above the chat window if you're logged into WebEx, or if you're on the phone, you can press #2. Here, I'm not sure if anybody has their hand raised. All right. Any last comments, Guillermo, before we close the call?
No, I think this meets the expectation that we created early in June, that we would be very closely tracking the conditions of the summer. I think the series of reports that we put forward met that expectation, and I think it was very useful for us to very closely track how things were working after we have implemented the different enhancements. I think this is setting ourselves for the next summer. There are several items that we have identified, including the discussion of the overscheduling, which are items that we have to address before the next summer. So I hope that this type of information has been useful for participants, and I would appreciate any feedback in terms of that material in any opportunity the participants may have. With this, I think that's all what we have for today, Cristina.
Great. Thank you, Guillermo. So just to double check here, anybody in the queue? I don't see any hands raised, but I'm not sure if there's anybody who joined by audio.
No questions in the queue.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. Again, we did record the call today, so I will post the video file once we receive it from the vendor. The materials related to this call are on the miscellaneous stakeholder meetings page, so that's where you'll find the presentation as well as the recording. So thank you again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.